Welcome to Identifying Standards and Creating Objectives. Upon completion of this video, you will have identified relevant science or math standards for your unit and developed SMART learning objectives for your unit. This may seem relatively easy, but some standards are more suitable to engineering challenges than others. Likewise, some standards are easier for students to grasp if they participate in hands-on activities such as engineering challenges. Finally, engineering design challenges can take up a considerable amount of class time. To justify that amount of time, you will most likely want to choose a high-stakes standard or a design challenge that incorporates application of a number of key standards. You will want to choose your standards wisely. As you know, public school teachers are bound to teach the academic standards adopted by their state. These could be national standards adopted by your state, such as the Next Generation Science Standards or the Common Core Math Standards. Alternatively, they could be standards unique to your state. If you teach in a private school, your school may determine which standards you are expected to teach. Some of you may teach upper-level advanced placement or international baccalaureate classes and are responsible to teach those standards. Regardless, let's take a look at an example. If you teach middle school science, depending on where you teach and at what grade level, you may be expected to cover energy transfer as a part of the physical science standards. For an engineering design challenge based on thermal energy transfer, let's examine what standards could be tied to that challenge in Indiana or a state or school that has adopted the Next Generation Science Standards. If you're a 7th grade science teacher in Indiana, here's a snapshot of the physical science standards related to energy transfer. An engineering design challenge related to thermal energy could easily incorporate this standard, as well as a number of other individual standards within that core. The Next Generation Science Standards for middle school also address energy transfer. In NGSS, no specific grade level is indicated. If you look at these standards closely, you will note that teachers are expected to create challenges where students can apply scientific principles to design, construct, and test a device that either minimizes or maximizes thermal energy transfer. Also included in the Next Generation Science Standards are 8 science and engineering practices that constitute best practices for science teachers. Many states that have not adopted NGSS still encourage and expect science teachers to incorporate these 8 practices into their classrooms. Good science teachers naturally incorporate the science and engineering practices as they involve higher order thinking skills. Notice that number 1 and number 6 specifically distinguish between science and engineering. Scientists ask questions and construct explanations about the natural world. However, engineers define societal problems and design solutions to address those problems using science and math concepts. The other 6 practices represent common practices of both scientists and engineers. As you build your units, think of ways you can incorporate some of these practices. Regardless of the content standards your units will address, if students engage in the science and engineering practices, they will be thinking and acting like scientists and engineers. Another key to developing a top-notch engineering design challenge unit is writing good learning objectives. You probably learned how to write objectives in your undergraduate studies, but it doesn't hurt to review. A good learning objective combines time, plus a learner, plus a Bloom's verb, plus a detail of what the student will do. We'll look at an example on the next slide. However, if you're not familiar with Bloom's verbs based on Bloom's taxonomy, please see the website referenced on the resources slide at the end of this module. Because engineering design challenge units typically encourage students to focus on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, You'll want at least some of your objectives to include verbs in the application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation roles. As you can see by the sample objective, time is by the end of the module. When you write your units, you might start with by the end of this unit or by the end of this lesson or activity. Next, you'll identify the learner. In most cases, this will simply be student or students. Next, choose a Bloom's verb. In the sample objective, the Bloom's verb is identify, which is in the comprehension domain of Bloom's taxonomy. Again, at least some of your objectives should contain verbs representing the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, such as apply, design, construct, assess, or defend. Finally, please provide the detail regarding what you expect your students to learn or do. In the sample, by the end of the module, the students will be able to identify the 9 components of the engineering design process. We would like to emphasize here that writing objectives with the learning outcomes specified is very important. So often, teachers make it hard on themselves by not taking the time to write good objectives. A good learning objective is student-focused and spells out what the student must be able to do at the end of the course. Remember the sample objective on the previous page? Students will be able to identify the 9 components of the engineering design process. If you're going to assess the students on something, make sure you write an objective with that assessment in mind. This makes it clear to the student what they are being held accountable for. Clear objectives with explicit learning outcomes are then very easy to assess if you specify what the students will be measured against. In our previous example, it spelled out the student must identify 9 components. To assess the student, you might create a formative assessment using a class brainstorming session or use a more formal end-of-unit summative assessment. Our advice? Spend appropriate time on the objectives as it will simplify your life. Here are some resources to help you as you work on your objectives.